The first speaker today is Cheryl Dinnell, and Cheryl is the program coordinator for the Respite RX program. She is also the parent of a son with multiple disabilities, and she is a disability advocate and a specialist in microboards, respite, and future planning. Cheryl, we look forward to hearing some of your information and results from the RX program. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. All right, so I am going to start with some information on our Respite RX program under the title, What Caregivers Need Now, related to it. It has been administered by the Nevada Aging and Disability Services Division. And for those of you who are not familiar with our Respite RX program, it's a pilot program. I'm going to provide a really quick overview. It's a voucher demonstration project for respite, funded by our Lifespan Respite grant. And of course, as we know, respite is a break from caregiving necessary for the self-care of the caregiver. And to get a break, caregivers need to be able to turn over care to someone else. Hopefully someone dependable, reliable, capable of providing care in their place. Respite breaks can be created in many different ways, so there's not just one way to deliver respite. The goal of this pilot program was to get caregivers to recognize the need for respite for themselves, and then to remove as many barriers as possible to get them to use it. Respite RX was designed to be self-directed, meaning the family caregiver would be given more choice, flexibility, and control over the design and delivery of their respite services, and more responsibility too. Respite RX was also designed to fill gaps in respite service, specifically to address needs in rural Nevada, as well as for families caring for individuals between 18 and 59 years of age. But we covered the full lifespan. Respite RX has some unique features that we wanted to test. And one of those unique features is is that the caregiver qualified for the respite. It's not based on the care recipient's eligibility. And I'll bring that up and the significance of that up again in just a minute. Through a person-centered planning process, families, caregivers were able to design respite to fit their needs, lifestyle, and preferences as much as it could be found in their community. The goal was to give each caregiver a dosage of respite on a regular basis for a full year, and to experience with them the opportunities and challenges they would encounter during that year. In designing how respite fit best for them, caregivers would describe some goals for respite: to see friends and family, get away for some time on their own, enjoy activities that were meaningful to them, and envision the return to caregiving feeling more relaxed, rejuvenated, and mentally and emotionally strong. This pilot program has generated a lot of data for discussion and consideration, but I'm only going to have time to touch on a few points today. We have done our best to adjust to changing circumstances and watch to see how our original premise for the design of Respite RX held up during the COVID-19 pandemic, amongst other challenges. We have learned a great deal from our family caregivers and have a greater appreciation for their role in our long-term supports and services. One of the first lessons that we learned came from the long-term care community. We got challenged on who we served and why we accept this caregiver or not. The question of whom do we serve became an important one to address. We chose to serve the caregiver, so the eligibility of the care recipient was not the driver of service. That was completely outside the norm in the long-term care community, when everything else was determined by the eligibility of the care recipient. Of course, it makes sense when all the funding for respite is tied to care recipient benefits, such as an individual disability, a disabled veteran, or someone with a specific healthcare condition. But it certainly changed the focus and priority of respite services. That's why we tend to know so little about our caregivers and know so much more about our care recipients. With Respite RX, we decided to honor the premise that respite was meant to benefit the caregiver. So it's interesting to be part of a gap filling program for respite. What are the gaps? How have we addressed these gaps in the past? Do funded programs that serve other older adults, for example, have the reach to serve families of older adults everywhere? Do caregivers not need respite unless they fall into a low income bracket or there's the right diagnosis at the right age? What if a caregiver's need for respite does not fit existing program hours or availability? Since we were open to gaps, programs were soon sending us their waitlist families. We had participants trying to benefit from respite under more than one respite programs because maybe one model did not meet their unique respite needs. And so was that double dipping? Other participants were told that they would risk services for their care recipient if they accepted respite under our program. This caused really confusing messaging to our caregivers who are attempting to utilize respite. So are we creating barriers, challenges, hoops to go through in order to have them benefit from a small break? No wonder some of them, it wasn't worth the hassle. If you're curious about what the hourly cost of respite ended up being, here is the numbers. Our guest average of $15 an hour was pretty much spot on. The range was from $8 to $26 per hour, with the average being $14.49. That's statewide. Respite programs have always had a really high dropout rate. No one knew why. We wondered why too. So here's our results. We became alarmed early on when we couldn't get people into the program fast enough and death had claimed their loved one. That's that orange section. For many others, death prevented us from giving the caregiver the full year of respite experience like we'd hoped. But we were glad to be at least actively engaged with the caregiver until that end of care. It was a hard experience to share with them, but we hope caregivers took some comfort in knowing they were able to care for and support their loved one at home until the end. Caregivers would say, I don't know why I waited so long to accept respite, because it was wonderful to receive. As a result, we feel strongly that we need to catch caregivers much earlier when offering respite supports. That message needs to get out there. Understanding respite is an issue. See the yellow section. We had applicants who thought respite workers were housekeepers or respite covered working caregivers or some other service type. So respite was the wrong fit, and we redirected them to resources we knew about or back to the Nevada Care Connection sites. There were also several who simply moved away after applying for our program. As displayed in purple, others had to make hard placement decisions for their loved one. The most troubling were the families too stressed to complete the process, those in the blue, the light blue. Some caregivers knew they needed respite, but the care recipient wouldn't let them accept it. Others were troubled by the responsibilities of a self-directed respite program. They were deterred by the need to find and hire their own respite provider. Don't you just send someone? That was the typical response. We tried to assist as much as possible, even helping to write job ads for the respite positions. Unfortunately, as a GAP program, Respite RX was likely the only option available to them outside of private paid respite. They just could not move forward. Some balked at the paperwork or the information they'd have to share. We tried to assist as much as possible, walking them through the forms they needed to complete. While they wanted respite, they didn't want to do the search for the respite worker or the provider agency. We had caregivers say they wouldn't hire a stranger, and they didn't have friends or family they would hire either. So it's kind of hard to move past some of these barriers. Whether the lack of reply category in green were people who were overwhelmed by the process, unconvinced they needed respite, or facing a barrier we might have been able to address, we'll never know. We have a very transient population. Trying to keep tabs on these applicants was difficult. We have yet a much clearer picture of the real drop-off rate and can develop some strategies to address these situations in the future. The direct the self-directed respite model piloted during our project was successful for families who would not have otherwise accessed respite. However, it also highlighted some challenges in caregiving and their acceptance of respite. We had to provide a higher level of case management support to our caregivers than most programs expect to provide. The respite model of self-direction was not a perfect solution on its own, particularly because families were so isolated and disconnected in their communities that they had no one who could help. As we are learning during this grant, families need significant support in connecting to worker resources for respite. According to the report Caregiving in the United States 2020, approximately 29% of caregivers who are the sole provider of care reported having no sources of help or the information to help them find services and supports for themselves and their care recipients. And Nevada families are no different. Connecting families with respite workers and providers is a huge need we struggle to meet. How to make workers and providers feel more like friends so caregivers and care recipients will allow them to share the care will hopefully be the focus of future respite programs projects. The commitment to care was extremely high among our participants. Most have provided 1 to 5 years of service already, so they're almost all long-term caregivers. But their confidence in their caregiving role was surprisingly low. By comparing the years of caregiving experience with the worries or caregiving concerns, it appears that all caregivers feel they should do a better job. And that's that orange bar. All of them are above 60%. So confidence there is missing. Also, the sense that they should be doing more for their loved one tends to increase with time in caregiving. That's the gray bar. Again, at or above 50% of all our participant pool. Do we truly see caregivers as that lifeline of care in our long-term care system? So the question is, if an agency saw that their staff had these levels of worry, concern, lack of confidence, what would they do? What do we do to address this for our caregivers and make sure they are supported? Maybe training and care skills and strategies for care. So I didn't have a single caregiver take up offers for training, even when we could arrange it for them and their respite workers. And our data shows that their interest or need for training and caregiving strategies decrease slightly as their years of experience increase. That's the yellow bar on top. And their worry and anxiety appeared to decline as well. That's the blue bar on the bottom. So it helps to offer these training and skill opportunities to caregivers early on, but it seems to miss the bigger picture. Would it surprise you to learn that nationally, caregiver support groups and caregiver support consultations are more effective in reducing worry and stress among caregivers than providing caregivers with training and skills development? Here's something else to think about. Caregivers are seeking, respite, that's the green line, when care levels for ADLs and IADLs, that's activities of daily living and instrumental activities of daily living, is relatively low, as indicated by the red and blue bars along the bottom of the chart. So there isn't a strong correlation between what care demands are required of them and their demand for respite support. One thing our data does suggest is that the demand for respite begins to build when the care assistance needed is starting to increase. The peak demand for respite was when about 39% of the care recipients, ADLs, IADLs, now required some assistance. Caregivers were already starting to feel the impact of care. So what matches more consistently with our referrals for respite? This chart reflects the care burden placed on the shoulders of our caregivers. The impact of caregiving on the life of a caregiver shows more consistent need for respite on an upward trend, that's the green line, when caregiving takes away more and more time for self, time with family and friends, and time for enjoyable activities that refresh and revive us. The bars on the bottom show the impact of no time for self, no social connections, no help with care, no choice in activities, and relationships hurt because of caregiving demands. Damage to relationships may be due to just never being able to see one another and invest the necessary time in keeping close, because caregiving has become the main focus of the caregiver's life. This is consistent with longings expressed in the respite design sessions with participants when they were asked the following questions. What would I do if I had a break from caregiving? And who would I spend time with during a break from caregiving? This longing with sadness does not diminish a caregiver's commitment to care, because whether driven by cultural or moral or familial reasons, our caregivers were fully committed to care. They have just sacrificed everything that keeps them going. It's like they put themselves in the driver's seat of a vehicle to drive forward for as long as they can, but they don't ever stop to refill the tank. But they would do so if they could. But on this road, there's just no place they can pull in and stop and refuel. Others would describe this longing with sadness as loneliness. Does that fit our caregivers? Loneliness is an indicator of social well-being. It is the feeling of missing an intimate relationship, referred to as emotional loneliness, or missing a wider social network, referred to as social loneliness. Loneliness is the sense of suffering from being disconnected from other people, which is different from social isolation, which is simply not being around other people or not having close connections. People who have moved to a place where they are newcomers frequently report social loneliness. Hello, welcome to Nevada. That's very typical. Emotional loneliness arises when a partner relationship dissolves through the effects of disease and disability, and is characterized by intense feelings of emptiness, abandonment, and forlornness. We found evidence of both these types in our data. Is respite the right answer for loneliness? Best test case, a COVID-19 pandemic. Like everyone nationwide, Nevada was impacted by COVID-19. We saw providers shut down, limit their services to only essential services, or shift to other activities to help bring caregivers and their families some relief. Unpaid caregivers were acknowledged as a part of the long-term care support system, but supports such as respite were considered non-essential service, despite the size of the workforce it supports. How did our Respite RX program hold up? About 48% of our participants, that's in the little bit darker blue, did not see any impact at all, because they usually hired family or friends, and those people limited their risk of bringing germs into the household. There were also a few vendors who continued to send workers under stricter service policies to mitigate risks. Some were saying that our respite service was the only thing they were still receiving. About 45% of the participants in green did see impacts to their respite services. Of those, about 19%, and that's in the box, the light blue box, self-imposed or suspended respite services over COVID-19 fears. Another 26% in the yellow box had program closures, respite workers who had to go under self-quarantine, or impacts to respite plans because of event cancellations or business closures and travel restrictions. Those who had respite throughout the COVID pandemic fared far better than those who had to restrict their access to respite or who lost their access to respite. Mental health supports against risks such as compassion fatigue were mostly displaced by emergency response for food, medical care, and PPE. I say mostly because there were some signs that caregivers did get some care that they desperately needed, but I don't know that we realize what it is that we did right or why it was so important. If we're to learn anything from our COVID-19 experience, I hope to highlight what fundamentally is important to caregivers, and remember this as we continue to serve and support caregivers. When government advised self-isolation and announced stay-at-home orders to stop the spread of COVID-19, millions of us lost 1 million little social outlets While temporarily sacrificing our socializing to slow a worldwide pandemic was a trade most of us were certainly willing to make, our society saw record calls on suicide hotlines, spikes in domestic violence, and alarms raised on every mental health measure we track, on depression, anxiety, eating disorders, you name it. We already have had research studies from back in 2010 that found these relationship impacts to our physical health were so profound that chronic loneliness and isolation can be as dangerous as a pack-a-day smoking habit. Loneliness can shorten lifespan by about 5 years. Interestingly, caregiving long-term has been known to do the same. The study's big reveal was that social disconnection turned out to be worse for health than big name problems like obesity, alcoholism, or pollution, and beat out other factors like high blood pressure and high cholesterol levels. People who don't have strong social support mechanisms, think trusted friends and family members, persistently experience poor outcomes. That's scary because loneliness is nearly a universal experience that crosses borders and cultures and can affect us as easily when we're in a crowd as when we're alone. For the first time in a long time, caregivers feeling stuck at home had something in common with their peers who were not necessarily caregivers, but were now equally stuck at home. Everyone had to figure out how to do things when no one could leave their home without jumping through hoops of prevention and precaution. While loneliness is not a mental health condition, those who grapple with depression or anxiety are at significantly greater risk for experiencing loneliness. In turn, loneliness and isolation can exacerbate existing mental health challenges and create a vicious cycle. Loneliness is a perception, and not everyone who's isolated or even lives alone feels lonely. But in times of uncertainty, hello, coronavirus, we're more likely to crave the reassurance of connection. When we can't find someone close to offer support, loneliness enters. It's uncomfortable to discuss loneliness. No one wants to become an object of pity. So there's a lot of stigma and shame around loneliness, and a lot of people don't want to admit it. But loneliness is simply a biological imperative like hunger. When you're hungry, it's your body's way of saying, hey, it's time to eat. Similarly, loneliness is your body and mind's way of saying, hey, you need to be around people. Most caregivers are feeling a hunger for social connection, but the silver lining of COVID-19 may be highlighting how devastating social isolation really is. Maybe the coronavirus will be what finally makes this clear. Through the pandemic, we have all been given a taste of what it's like to be cut off from loved ones. But for family caregivers, loneliness and social isolation were pretty standard experiences well before social distancing and sheltering in place aggravated the problem. I had caregivers say, we've got this, we are experts at social distancing. But even after COVID-19 is controlled, loneliness will be that shadow pandemic that remains. So here's what we did right. Regular contact and checking on families, caregivers, staff, and volunteers has been the right COVID-19 response. The food and supplies were necessary and appropriate relief, but the contact we made was life savings, knowing that someone cared. I came across this quote: "One of the greatest gifts we can give other people is the gift of our full attention." I certainly think our caregivers deserve more of our attention. Another area we've struggled with is health literacy during the pandemic, where solid information wasn't readily available and misinformation was rampant. Health literacy means caregivers and care recipients had the knowledge and decision-making skills to know how to address the various health impacts experienced, such as during the COVID pandemic. Instead of having that confidence, families tended to avoid all risk instead of mitigating them and making solid judgments on the services they would receive and accept. We just talked about the negative impacts that come with loneliness and isolation. So thankfully, we are getting some valuable tools now through our national partner, ARCH, Respite Network, and through some outstanding work done by a team of dedicated professionals to provide agencies and caregivers with decision-making tools so they can carefully consider both caregivers' own needs, again, balance against the needs of their loved one, and start to deliver services and allow caregivers to regain the respite services they still desperately need. It's hard to see families experience fatigue, frustration, anxiety, and aggravated health conditions because they could no longer access the respite service they once enjoyed. It's like trying to stuff them back in the box when you were the one that finally helped them get out. It's also hard to see families so scared of making a wrong decision regarding their loved one. They again made all the sacrifices as they committed to stick it out at home for as long as it takes. In the respite world, a valuable long-term care workforce is at risk if we don't take their needs seriously, and I hope we won't leave them alone anymore. If you'd like more information about our program or to receive the final report on the pilot when it's available, just contact us directly. We are in the final months of the program and certainly know that there's a lot of work on respite that lies ahead. And we'd love to hear from others interested in improving and preserving respite services for caregivers in Nevada. Thanks.